Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an unfortunate reality of today's politics that Democrats do not believe in democracy. They believe in power. It speaks volumes that S1, the very first bill introduced by Chuck Schumer and the Democrats in this Senate, is a bill for the federal government to take over elections and to strike down virtually every reasonable voter integrity law adopted across the country. It is likewise the case that H.R. 1, the first bill introduced by Nancy Pelosi, is the same bill, a federal takeover of elections designed to strike down virtually every reasonable voter integrity law in the country. The priority of Democrats is not COVID, as the rhetoric might suggest. The priority of Democrats is not jobs. The priority of Democrats is not our national security. The priority of Democrats is to ensure that Democrats stay in power no matter what. No matter what the voters think, this bill before us is designed to prevent those pesky voters from ever making a decision other than electing Democrats. And it's a long tradition. Jim Crow was exactly the same thing. Democratic politicians writing laws, changing the election laws to ensure the voters could only elect Democrats. Sadly, there are decades of ugly history behind this. You know, before I was in the Senate, I was a constitutional litigator and Supreme Court litigator. I didn't do a lot of redistricting law, but I did in 2003 and 2004 and 2005 represent the state of Texas in the redistricting litigation that occurred then. And I have to say I agree with Chief Justice Roberts, who described in one voting rights case, it is a sordid business, this divvying us up by race, because that is much of what redistricting law is right now. It is focused on, in that case, we heard testimony. We heard testimony actually from African-American elected Democrats in Texas about the racist history of Democrats in Texas. And in particular, when the state legislature in 2003 passed a new congressional redistricting map, it was replacing a map that had been passed by Democrats in Texas that had been widely described as the most egregious gerrymander in the country. It was a map that, even though a substantial majority of Texans were voting consistently Republican, elected Democrats and a large majority of congressional Democrats, despite the views of the voters. And Democrats fought tooth and nail, including fleeing to Ardmore, Oklahoma, including fleeing to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to try to keep their partisan gerrymander in place, to elect Democrats, even though the voters didn't want to elect Democrats. And the testimony we heard at trial from African-American elected Democrats was that the strategy of white Democrats to elect white Democrats was very simple. A moment ago, we heard about thresholds of minority representations in districts. The testimony we heard at trial is that white Democrats knew that if you put a sufficient number of African-American voters in a district, but not too many, and a sufficient number of Hispanic voters in a district, but not too many, that in the primary, that the African-American Democratic voters would join with white Democratic voters in voting against an Hispanic Democrat, and that the Hispanic Democratic voters would join with white Democratic voters in voting against a black Democrat. And the result would be exactly what happened in Texas. White Democrats would win the primaries, and then those minority voters would vote for Democrats in the general, and it would ensure that white Democrats stay in power in perpetuity. Texas legislature, the Republican legislature, eliminated that gerrymander and resulted in a map that actually elected a congressional delegation that reflected the views of the voters of Texas. And Democratic activists viewed that as an abomination. Why? Because their objective is to elect Democrats. In the state of Texas, I'm the first Hispanic ever elected as a U.S. Senator. The activists who are engaged on these issues did not celebrate that issue because you are not Hispanic if you are not Democrat in their view. Never mind that every time I've been on the ballot in Texas, over 40% of Hispanics have voted for me. Never mind that Texas is the only majority-minority state in the union that consistently elects Republicans. That arouses the ire of Democratic activists, because we minorities aren't supposed to think for ourselves. In fact, we're told by enlightened Democrats that we Hispanics are too dumb to figure out how to get a driver's license. I'll be damned. We can't drive a car. We can't get on a plane. We can't get married. We're just not smart enough. It's offensive and it's ridiculous. It's why the overwhelming majority of Americans support voter ID, because they know the Democrats, they don't even believe what they're saying. They know that. This is about political power. That's what it's all about. And what does this bill say? If you believe in democracy, what do you want? If you believe in democracy, you want the voters to be able to vote for policies they support. That would mean if the voters support for policies like photo ID, you should have a photo ID law. This bill says, no. You voters are not smart enough to know that. We're going to take the power away from you by giving it to unelected bureaucrats who can strike down what an entire state legislature, in Texas, our legislature is elected by 29 million people. One bureaucrat at the Department of Justice has more power under this bill than 29 million people in the state of Texas. You want to talk about something offensive to democracy? Saying one bureaucrat at DOJ has more power to enact laws than 29 million voters going and exercising the democratic franchise. You know, earlier in this hearing, we heard testimony about discrimination against Asian Americans. I agree, there's a lot of discrimination against Asian Americans. Some of the most egregious discrimination against Asian Americans occurs in elite academic institutions like Harvard and Yale and Princeton that discriminate against Asian Americans, that have quotas against Asian Americans. I'm a graduate of Princeton and Harvard. The chairman is a graduate of Yale. All of those institutions have quotas that are every bit as noxious as the quotas in the 50s and 60s against Jews. They were enforced against Jews. We don't want too many Jews, is what those academic institutions said. Now they say we don't want too many Asian Americans. We're going to have reverse quotas. What's one of the very first things the Biden Department of Justice did? The Civil Rights Division. They dismissed the lawsuit from the U.S. Department of Justice against Yale University for discriminating against Asian Americans, because politically they support that discrimination. And I would note, by the way, earlier this year, when voting on a bill on Asian American discrimination, I introduced an amendment. It was a one-paragraph amendment that said federal funds shall not flow to any educational institution that discriminates against Asian Americans in admissions or in granting scholarships. It was straightforward, it was simple, and every single Democrat in the United States Senate voted against it. Every single Democrat said, in effect, we support discriminating against Asian Americans when it suits our politics. This ain't about protecting the rights of voters. This is about keeping Democrats in power. Ms. Reardon, you've served in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Can you tell this committee the extent to which that division has exercised partisan decision-making in your experience?
One of the things, one of the most egregious situations that I've observed is when the city of Kinston, North Carolina, submitted a change for preclearance wherein they were no longer going to run on a party. They wanted to run nonpartisan. And this is an African-American majority city. So the African-Americans controlled, the city council who wanted to make that change. And the department objected to the change because it felt, and in its letter, it said basically that if there was no D next to the name of the candidates, then the African Americans would no longer get elected and they would not know who to vote for. So they were clearly protecting the Democrat Party, and they were also insulting the African Americans that live within the city of Kinston, as well as the elected officials.
Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of protecting the Democratic Party and insulting African American voters and Hispanic voters in the process. Mr. Chairman, I have in front of me a statement from Steve Marshall, who's the Attorney General of Alabama, who has submitted a statement that responds to charges that voter integrity laws are unnecessary. and cites, among other things, 2 Alabama mayoral elections in 2016 that were overturned because of voter fraud. So I ask unanimous consent that this statement be included in the record.
Without objection.
We ought to be protecting democracy. We shouldn't be, neither party should be engaged in partisan efforts to stay in power. But I would note, it is the Democrats in Congress who have set their very first priority, keeping Democrats in power. Democracy be damned.
We are here because we want more people to vote. We want to remove obstacles to vote. We want to increase access, regardless of how they vote, what party they're in. That is the narrowly tailored and targeted purpose of the measure before us.